So within North America today, psychoanalytic theory has largely devolved into a psychology of consciousness. This was initiated by the intersubjective, relational, and postmodern trends that have gradually formed a foothold in American training environments and academic institutions that are at times radically opposed to classical theory and technique introduced by Freud and the post-Freudians. Other parts of the world may be unfamiliar with these developments as Freud, Jung, Klein, and Lacan continue to command a great deal of respect among academe and the intelligentsia. But with the contemporary turn, any form of unconscious process is intersubjectively, hence relationally, constituted. This implies that even unconscious drives, which are part of our embodied biological constitutions, are originally derived from conscious experience. These notions lend themselves to the decentering intrapsychic activity over relational interaction and draw into question the unity of the self, the preexistent developmental history of the patient prior to treatment, the prehistory of unconscious processes independent of one's relatedness to others, and a priori mental organizations that precede engagement with the social world. Furthermore, with the current emphasis on dissociation and the multiplicity of the self, contemporary psychoanalysis fails to adequately account for the notion of personal agency, freedom, and separateness of the self as an enduring subject with personal identity. Because contemporary perspectives replace psychoanalysis as a science of unconscious mental processes with an intersubjective ontology that privileges consciousness over unconsciousness, this appears to subordinate the value of psychoanalysis as an original contribution to understanding human experience. This lecture will address some of these conundrums in contemporary theory and reintroduce the validity of a primal unconscious ontology. Contemporary perspectives on the unconscious vary widely in scope and content, from displacing the dynamic unconscious altogether to appealing to neuroscience, or to favoring postmodern sensibilities that subordinate psychical processes to language. Donald Stern and Philip Bromberg, both from New York City, are two such proponents of these redirective shifts in contemporary thought. And the force of their ideas have arguably reshaped the way many contemporary analysts have come to conceive of mental processes. However rich in clinical utility these theoretical postulates are, without serious conceptual omissions, particularly when raising the question of selfhood, agency, and unconscious enactments. In what follows, I will attempt to offer an elaborated meditation on the philosophical implications of their claims, with the hope that this may lead to a spirited dialogue between advocates of a dissociative model of mind and those who privilege a dynamic unconscious. Both Stern and Bromberg have enjoyed theoretical prominence within contemporary psychoanalysis by questioning the predisposed dominion of the unconscious over the puissance of consciousness and language. One cannot ignore in good faith how Herculean, causally efficacious, and advantageous conscious experience, especially the role of language, has on psychological organization and development, which of course transpires within the contours of our familiar attachments and cultural environs. Notwithstanding these, there appears to be a predilection among some theorists to construct a false dichotomy between these categories when both stand in relation to their dialectical, hence symmetrical counterparts. Yet for others there is a tendency to collapse one category into the other, thereby erasing any distinction between the two realms or orders. One such proponent is Don Stern. As I understand him, unconscious experience is only that which was introduced in some fashion through consciousness, yet actively interrupted, suspended, unattended to, blocked, and or avoided, hence left unformulated. Whether this be material semiotically encoded and sequestered on parallel levels of distributed processing, defensive constellations designed to protect the subject from psychic threat, the pure formal realm of potentiality, or as pre-reflective, non-propositional thought, lacking attention, self-conscious awareness, or mnemonic potency. In the end, Stern seems to equate unconscious experience with anything that could potentially apply to the most sophisticated forms of unconscious mental functioning or a simple act of conscious inattention. Stern's view is so radically postmodern that he is willing to grant language the status of being and volitional agency without realizing the aporia he generates. Not only does he believe that, quote, language is the condition for experiencing, end quote, he opines that, quote, in a very real sense, language uses us. We have become the utensils. Language is no longer our tool, but the very crucible of our experience, end quote. Here Stern has us believe that somehow language is a hypothesized entity that has a will and an intentionality all of its own. But words don't think. They don't possess agency. They have no intentionality. They direct nothing. Words in themselves are impotent and meaningless without a mediational subject who directly assigns them signification and meaning. Stern is so committed to the linguistic term that he is willing to deny pre-linguistic or pre-verbal psychic organizations, drives, somatic structures, affective resonance states, emotive and or intuitive processes, and translinguistic and extra-linguistic experience, such as aesthetic or spiritual sensibilities, for the belief that nothing can, quote, possibly come before words, end quote. Since Freud's early departure from a dissociative model of consciousness for a repression model of unconscious process, psychoanalysis has been tacitly led to believe that dissociation and repression are mutually exclusive categories, when they are not. Contemporary theorists seize upon this assumption when advocating for dissociation as a better theory for understanding unconscious experience, at the expense of retaining repression as a viable construct that aids clinical theory. The either-or false dichotomy that gets erected is that dissociation displaces the need for a repression model, or that dissociation becomes subsumed or tantamount to repressive functions. Stern defines dissociation as, quote, the avoidance of certain formulations of present experience, which is a channel or current along which certain meanings can flow and others cannot. To dissociate is simply to restrict the interpretations one makes of experience, or a restriction on the experiences we allow ourselves to have, end quote. Here Stern equates the phenomenon with unconscious experience, but not in any dynamic way. That is, not in a way that an unconscious agency orchestrates, executes, sustains, or harbors. Dissociation from this definition is entirely possible through the operations of consciousness. What we may infer is that unconsciousness is really only non-conscious events, such as those regulatory functions belonging to our neurobiology. Here there is no need to postulate a dynamic unconscious. There is no unconscious teleology, no unconscious ego directing such mental actions, no unconscious intentionality of any kind. Formulations or interpretations that are avoided or barred are simply linguistic processes that are either foreclosed or restricted. What Stern calls the unconscious is merely formed through the repudiation or absence of linguistic construction. We also see a similar line of conceptualization in Jody Mesler-Davies and Mary Gale Frawley's depiction of dissociation as a, quote, an organization of mind, wherein traumatic memories are split off from associative accessibility to the remainder of conscious thought. But rather than being repressed or forgotten, they all alternate in a mutually exclusive pattern with other conscious ego states, end quote. Davies and Frawley juxtapose dissociation as a process of splitting that relegates mnemonic content not to an unconscious reservoir, but rather to an altered state of conscious ego states. From this definition, as with Stern, there is no need to posit a dynamic unconscious. Dissociation simply becomes a conscious phenomenon. But this definition soon encounters problems. How can memory persist alongside other conscious ego states when by definition one cannot remember them at any given moment? If something is conscious, would it not be accessible, at least in principle, especially if the subject is primed to draw one's attention to it or to be alerted to it? In fact, if this is indeed the case, this would be tantamount to Freud's early theory of preconscious awareness, namely the preconscious system. Yet this process of memorialization is not described by Davies and Frawley. How could, quote, memories sustain themselves without some form of unconscious preservation, given that they are not associatively accessible to consciousness? Are we to attempt to resolve this conundrum by postulating another parallel stream of consciousness that keeps the two domains separate, which is what the early pioneers of dissociation theory proposed, especially those espoused by Genet and Charcot in France, and simultaneously Morton Prince in the United States? And if so, how is contemporary relational theory any different from the old guard? Furthermore, one may ask, how can traumatic memories be related to patterns of consciousness, when by definition they are not remembered or accessible to consciousness? Parallel or corresponding levels of consciousness become untenable unless you either advocate for an alternative or a multiple agencies that are organizing these complex mnemonic, affective, and ideational states that are kept separate from one another, or unless you ascribe to the notion of a central agency that orchestrates and assigns the divisibility and dispersal of conscious content. Given Davies and Frawley's disavowal of a repression model in favor of a dissociative model of consciousness, by definition their position would fall under some form of parallelism or occasionalism. But if you posit this possibility, how would you reconcile the question of multiplicity and agency? And even if you were able to successfully defend a coherent theory of dissociation based solely on a model of consciousness, this would still mean an eclipse of the fundamental tenet of psychoanalysis, the primacy of unconscious mentation. Stern's focus on dissociation as both a defensive process as well as a benign passivity of inattention further parallels Bromberg's work on the subject, What Stern calls unformulated, Bromberg calls unsymbolized. In fact, it is in the realm of the, quote, pre-symbolized experience, end quote, where dissociation transpires on unconscious levels of information processing, that block or abort the emergence of formulated conceptual thought due to danger associated with conceptual formulations that are too cognitively intense to bear. Like Freud's repression censor, this implies an active barring or banning of consciousness, an aborting of the symbolization process altogether. Here, Bromberg underscores the centrality of trauma on psychic organization. Bromberg emphasizes the defensive and adaptive transformational capacities of dissociation as well as the pathological. He specifically points toward how dissociation leads to self-hypnoidal and asthmatic mental states, and how it becomes a normative and essential operation in the organization of personality. Of course, that which we are unaware of at any given moment becomes a form of unconsciousness, even if our attention may be drawn to it. The question becomes, how are these self-hypnoidal and anesthetic states instituted if by definition we are unaware of ourself during such operations? More specifically, how is dissociation capable of lending order and organization to personality structure if by definition it is fractious and non-conciliable? What is not directly discussed by Stern and Bromberg is how unconscious agentic processes instantiate themselves as dissociative enactments. Presumably, Stern would deny the unconscious any agency, or at least this is inferred from his text, while Bromberg would not. But these are not questions they directly entertain. It is not enough to confirm the ontic function of dissociation without explaining how it is made possible to begin with. What I have argued elsewhere is that unconscious experience as dissociability is derived from the basic dialectical processes that govern mental life, first and foremost constituted through unconscious agency, and more specifically the unconscious ego. Dissociation is momentary fragmentation and self-continuity, itself a spacing, a split, fissure, or gap in being. From this standpoint, dissociation is the agentic expression and overdetermination of unconscious motivation as teleological intent. In many ways, dissociation is a failure at representation. Whether this be a failure to represent visual images of events such as traumas, affective resonance states, or somatic forces that persist as embodied unconscious memorializations. Such unconscious schemata may actively resist becoming recollected within conscious awareness when under the direction of defense and self-protective currents, or evade conceptual formulation or linguistic articulation in consciousness for a variety of reasons, defensively motivated or not. Moreover, dissociative content may have simply not been encoded due to adaptive and normatively benign aspects of inattention, detachment, or compartmentalization. Most importantly, dissociative processes must be directed by a mental agent executing such dynamic activity. And here, with the exception of Ron Nasso, I do not see this issue being directly addressed by many contemporary writers. Dissociability in its most elemental form is none other than the proclivity of the psyche to split or modify itself from its original simple unity as embodied apperceptive desire, dividing itself into bits or pieces of self-experience through self-externalization, only then to regather and recover its self-division and externalization and incorporate itself back into its immediate self-constitution or internal structure, only to have the process repeat itself endlessly through an ongoing trajectory of dynamic pattern. In psychoanalysis, we have come to call this process projective identification. My understanding of the unconscious is that it is process-oriented, process-driven, and process-derived. What I have outlined in the theoretical system I have coined dialectical psychoanalysis, or process psychology. Process psychology displaces the primacy of language over the unconscious, but it does not negate the value of signification. Instead, the unconscious institutes and incorporates the sign and builds a whole elaborate matrix of unconscious semiotics that conforms to its own laws and its own rules of signification, fashioned by its own hands. The linguistic turn in psychoanalysis only partially accounts for unconscious dynamics. For the postmodern collapse of the subject and subjectivity in favor of the reification of language, in my mind, is misguided. What is fundamentally at stake is the ontological status of the unconscious. Freud alerts us to the fact that the unconscious declares itself as discontinuities in consciousness, what I prefer to call spacings of the abyss. We know them as apertures, as perforations, or lapses in experience, where time is momentarily eclipsed by the presencing of absence, a hole in being. Dissociation is only one such phenomenon in our gaps of experience, what Stern refers to as empty space in the beginning of life. But such empty space is full of non-being, of nothingness. Hence, no thing is there, only experiential flow, appetitive pulsation, desire, a hovering over a clearing, simultaneously exposed yet closed, open yet occlusive, the dawning gulf of the abyss. The abyss is never completely consolidated or unified, only discontiguous, but unifying in its functions. While many contemporary psychoanalytic theorists remain naive to formal metaphysics, various factions have also posed divided and contradictory notions of the nature and meaning of the self. What has generally been uncontested among several predominant postmodern positions, more specifically within the genre of Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida, is the insistence that the autonomous self is a fiction. As Lacan put it, the ego is an illusory misrecognition of the other. These convictions reify society, culture, and language, hence semiotics, which in turn define all discourse about selfhood and thus causally determine any element of personal agency that we might attribute to an individuated subject. In other words, all aspects of personal subjectivity have been conditioned by cultural signifiers that subordinate the individual to the symbolic order that's operative within one society. From this standpoint, there is no individual, hence no self. And what we may customarily call a self is nothing other than a linguistic invention based on social construction. On the other hand, when discourse on the self is given attention in the relational literature, the notion of the self has been theoretically altered from a single unity to a multiplicity of selves. Popular among some contemporary analysts today is the belief that there is no singular unitary self. Rather, there's a multiplicity of selves that exist within each subject, and in turn are ultimately governed by an intersubjective or dyadic system that determines how multiplicity is instantiated to begin with. Bromberg is clear when he says, quote, "There is no such thing as an integrated self," end quote. Instead, there are other, many, or several selves, quote. It is one thing to argue that there are multiple ego alterations or self-states that populate intrapsychic life due to the multiple operations of psychic modification, such as through the parameters of dissociation and defense. But it is quite another thing to say that each subject contains a conglomeration of multiple selves that may or may not be in touch with one another, yet exist and act as independent nominal agents within a singular mind. Although I agree that self-states may be modified elements of original instantiations as previous expressions of mental processes that have undergone internal division, differentiation, and transmogrification, which may further be experienced or experientially realized as atemporal, non-unified, incongruent, dissociated, and or alienated aspects of mind. It is unfathomable to me how one can view a singular subject as possessing multiple selves that coalesce as extant independent entities. Multiplicity can be legitimately explained as a unique and particularized experiential activity within the mind that has potentially formed or acquired new organizations of self-experience and adaptation through defensive transformations of earlier or conflicted archaic processes that are in response to real or perceived threat, anxiety, and or trauma. And this is substantiated time and again in clinical practice. But when you commit to the proposition of multiple entities within a singular subject, you have the messy burden of explaining how multiple entities could possibly exist within a singular embodied being, whereby each entity inhabits the same body, perceptual apparatus, and experiential medium, regardless of qualitative differences in desire, content, or form. The resultant array of conundrums is unbounded. Who is the governing agent among agencies? And how could you epistemologically justify that there is such a governing agent to begin with? Who or what organizes or unifies the cacophony of experience if there are different beings within one mind? Who or what is ultimately in control of the mind? How can multiple selves share anything derived from their own nature when by definition they are independent entities that compose different natures? Separate entities, by definition, cannot share or participate of the same nature because they have separate essences by virtue of their differences. Yet discourse on multiplicity directly assumes that separate selves within a singular mind can intuit, feel, absorb, influence, and communicate with one another. Hence, they must have a shared essence in order to do so. Therefore, multiple selves within one mind cannot exist because they would not have any ability to converse or have contact with other selves in any way unless they were derived from the same essence. Some theorists seemingly confound this issue. Separate selves eliminate the possibility that there could be any shared psychic participation among these different selves because they would have to have separate experiential mediums or apparatuses that radically vary in phenomenological content and form. What this means is that all experience would have to be perceived and assimilated by a separate psychic register within each self or self-state, and hence organized by independent agentic forces processing and guiding self-experience. But how could this be so? How could two or more entities with two or more essences cohabitate and participate of each other's essence when they are ontologically distinct, thus incapable of intermingling without altering their essences, hence annulling any notion of difference to begin with? These are palpable logical contradictions that any metaphysical theory of duality or multiplicity must be able to account for in order to salvage some theoretical credibility. From my standpoint, a multiplicity thesis is most legitimately justified by appealing to a developmental monistic ontology, governing the subjective mind of each individual, thus accounting for psychic division, differentiation, and modification of content and form, for example, self-states, without generating separate psychic entities, qua selves, each with their own separate essence. To justify a theory of mutually exclusive multiple essences that have the capacity to interact and intermingle would lead to some form of occasionalism, monadology, or parallelism, each with their own particular set of problems. Explanations of modified self-states, psychic realms, or experiential orders of subjectivity are quite different from multiple subjects. And this is precisely what the relationalists who avouch such a theory of multiple selves need to consider. Elizabeth Howe conceptualizes mind as reducible to dissociative processes, and she is following in the same theoretical trend as many relational postmoderns. This view lends itself to parsimonious and possibly reductive accounts of the complexifications of mental functioning. Not to mention it introduces a theoretical problematic for not adequately addressing the question of agency within a dissociative model. If everything we call mental or psychical is a multiplicity of self-states, how is a state organized? What processes or mechanisms are operative that constitute dissociability to begin with? Does this merely devolve into neurobiology? From my account, one has to have active unconscious agentic functions executing mental activity, or this argument collapses into and privileges a materialist model of consciousness. Following this line of reasoning, the unconscious is not a necessary psychoanalytic construct, let alone an ontological force in the mind. Furthermore, if you do not allow for agency directing mental activity on multiple levels of systemic psychic organization, conjoined as a unifying totality that makes multiplicity possible, then you have a problem with human freedom and causality to boot. If dissociation theory is to replace a model of dynamic unconscious processes and is said to account for all normative and pathological enactments, then how are enactments executed if you cannot sufficiently account for agency? And if agency is to be attributed to consciousness, and dissociation occurs outside of conscious awareness, then are we not begging the question of what constitutes dissociation? If dissociative enactments devolve into consciousness, then this is contradictory, because dissociation is presumed to transpire outside of conscious awareness. And if the answer is somewhere to be found in brain processes, then are we not committed to a material reduction or a mereological fallacy? Not only does this not adequately answer to the question in mechanics of dissociative enactments, it subverts the philosophical question of unconscious agency. Freud talks about how the splitting of consciousness that takes place in defense is in the service of keeping affect and ideation detached from one another. This ideation, however, is not merely dissociative, where signification and thought are relegated to what is simply unformulated, as Stern would tell us. Rather, for Freud, ideas are weakened, yet held in dynamic reserve until, quote, a fresh impression succeeds in breaking through the barrier erected by the will, end quote. This is the beginning of Freud's theory of a dynamic unconscious that thinks and actively converts mental phenomenon by either producing associative links or by creating disjunctions. The former involves assigning a semiotic to unconscious experience. The latter involves instituting a protective function. Here I believe that Freud succeeds in accounting for both dissociation within consciousness, as well as explaining how the content of what becomes dissociated, like affect or sense impressions or ideas, is organized within the unconscious abyss. This means that unconscious content has a life and a force of its own that is sustained within a dynamic underworld and creates unconscious pressure that becomes an onus for the ego to deal with. What this ultimately means is that dissociation and repression are not incompatible processes or contrary psychoanalytic theoretical models that clash with one another or cancel each other out. Unlike Stern, who professes that, quote, in most interpersonal and relational schemes, dissociation replaces repression, end quote. I believe that they operate on stratified levels of psychic reality carried out and maintained by the dynamic agency that properly belongs to the unconscious ego. Dissociative enactments must be exercised by an agentic, teleological organization of mind, executing the enactments, or else you have the intractable problem of multiple essences conversing, or you have the view of the mind as a biological machine that is turned on by the environment devoid of freedom and agency. This sounds like Skinner is potentially alive and well within contemporary psychoanalysis. Although I can't do justice to this complex issue here, I do propose that an adequate solution may be found by conceiving the multiplicity of the self as a dispersal of modified and differentiated self-states or micro-agents that are ontologically conjoined and inseparable from a unitary self that is a unifying unifier, but not that it is a static or unified. Rather, the self is pure process that is systematically and developmentally organized as a dynamic, self-articulated, complex holism. Here, the inherent dichotomizing that characterizes the unitary versus multiple self debate can find resolve in a process psychology that dialectically accounts for plurality within a unifying conception of mind. Since Freud, and to some degree Jung and Lacan, I'm unaware of any psychoanalyst who has attempted to offer a comprehensive systematic metaphysics. My formal academic studies in philosophy came after my training in clinical psychology and psychoanalysis, and therefore I became immediately enchanted with forming an intimate relationship between these two broad disciplines. In a series of works culminating in 2 books, my take on dialectical psychology is largely derived from Hegel's dialectical logic. Having amended Hegel's dialectic to complement contemporary psychoanalytic paradigms, I provide a process account of the coming into being of unconscious agency that conditions the subsequent emergence and organization of all other forms of psychic reality. As a result, I offer a novel thesis on the unconscious mind by explicating the origins of psychic experience and attempt to delineate in a systematic way how unconscious semiotics are the preconditions for subjectivity and mental processes in general, including language, intersubjectivity, and social relations, and ultimately human culture. Admittedly lofty in scope, my particular brand of process psychology is concerned with expatiating the ontological conditions that make knowledge and experience possible. Dialectical psychoanalysis is an attempt to systematically explain how the unconscious generates mind and all facets of psychic reality. Reality is constituted by mind as agentic process that emerges, grows, and matures from its basal primitive form to more robust configurations of conscious life, self-reflection, and social order. Psychic reality begins as unconscious experience constituted through pre-subjective and pre-reflective events that collectively organize into an unconscious sense of agency. The coming into being of this agentic function signals the coming into being of subjectivity, which becomes the fountainhead for future forms of psychic life to materialize and thrive. What this means is that before we can speak of the infant, before we can speak of the mother or the attachment system, before we can speak of culture or language, we have to account for the internally derived unconscious activity that makes consciousness, attachment, and social relations possible. Process psychology shows how internally mediated relations become the ground and prototype for all external relations, as well as how the structures of unconscious subjectivity allow for intersubjective dynamics to unfold and transpire. The unconscious is real, although it is not an entity. It is more appropriately understood as a series of spacings or presencing of certain facets of psychic reality, having loci, shape, and force in the indefinite ways in which they manifest as both the interiorization and external expression of agentic events. Here we are mainly concerned with the reality of the unseen and the ontological indivisibility of unconscious process. Process psychology displaces the primacy of language over the primacy and ubiquity of unconscious mentation, instead radicalizing an unconscious agency that modifies and differentiates itself and disperses its essence throughout its dialectical activities. Here I believe science and philosophy become intimately conjoined as a metaphysical enterprise. For there to be psychic determination or causation, there must be a determiner or source of activity that executes this formal act of bringing about mental functioning to begin with, what we may equate with unconscious agency. Freud was never able to adequately answer to the question of a unifying agency because he divided the mind up into competing agencies or systems or entities, culminating in his mature tripartite structural theory of 1923. Although Freud did offer an adumbrated attempt to explain how the I epigenetically developed from the it, as a differentiated and modified agency derived from its initial natural embodiment, he was not able to explain this developmental process with any precision. Now, in one of my books, Origins, on the Genesis of Psychic Reality, I offer what I believe to be the first systematic psychoanalytic metaphysics in the history of ideas, articulating the birth of psychic agency. Here I argue that structures of subjectivity are themselves conditioned a priori by an unconscious agency that's responsible for all forms of mental life to materialize and thrive, including consciousness. My reasoning relies upon the principle of sufficient reason, namely that there must be an original ground for every mental event that stands in relation to every mental object. Psychic activity doesn't just pop up ex nihilo. It must surface from an unconscious organizing principle I have metaphorically called the abyss. The unconscious abyss is itself a crude form of agency that performs executive functions and initiates determinate choices and actions through intentional maneuvers, as we are accustomed to refer to as drive derivatives, wishes, fantasies, defenses, compromise formations, self-states, dissociative enactments, or otherwise anything we may label as belonging to unconscious experience. The locus of this abyss rests within an agentic function that may be properly attributed to an unconscious ego that possesses formal capacities to execute intentional choice aimed toward purposeful ends, what I refer to as unconscious teleology. Now, how am I to convince the audience here that we all possess unconscious agency? Well, let me begin by asking, how could memory, representation, and semiotics be possible without an internal executor or an agency that performs formal functions of perceptual processing, categorization, retention, synthesis, unification, semiotic linkages, and information exchange? How could human experience be encoded, organized, transmuted, and transmitted via speech and behavior? Where would such activity come from? How could it be carried out if it was not initiated from an inner sense of functional form? In other words, consciousness is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for explaining these psychic processes that by definition transpire out of consciousness. Unconscious productions have a certain force and presence enacted by a formal, impersonal, agentic ego that lies at the heart of all teleological activity. How else could we explain mental events that are operative within psychic regions or territories unknown to immediate consciousness when they appear unannounced? Appealing to neuroscience, biology, or brain discourse gets us nowhere. Cognitive science cannot answer the question of agency because it makes consciousness an epiphenomenon, hence properties of the brain that possess no real causal powers of their own. And if we are content in boiling down mind to brain states, then what becomes of freedom and agency? The coming into being of psychic reality may be understood from the standpoint of a developmental monistic ontology, whereby there is a progressive unfolding of desire into an organizing and unifying process system we equate with the unconscious ego as an impersonal, executive, synthetic agency. This agency is merely formal. Hence, it's not a personal agent or a subject in any proper sense, which is commonly ascribed to human consciousness or selfhood. The abyss is initially immersed in its own corporeal, sentient embodiment. and awakens as appetitive motivational longing, its initial being in relation to lack. The abyss erupts from its self-enclosed original unity as pulsional desire. Such desirous rupture is in response to feeling its need, urge, or craving to experience and satiate the lack, which takes various initial forms that eventually breach into consciousness as ego proper. Originally, desire takes itself as its initial object through a form of pre-reflective self-consciousness I refer to as unconscious apperception, the pure experiential self-sense belonging to precognitive unconscious thought. The development of unconscious subjectivity ultimately follows an organic process based on a series of dialectical mediations, beginning as unconscious apperception and culminating in self-conscious reflection, the sublated domain of conscious human experience. Yet this initial rudimentary process of desirous rupture and apperception constitutes the birth of the human psyche. For mind is an epigenetic, architectonic, self-organizing achievement expressed as a dynamic, self-articulated, complex totality or psychic holism. Unconscious mind is a series of spacings that first instantiate themselves as a multitude of schemata, which are the building blocks of psychic reality. A schema is a desirous, apperceptive ideational unit of self-experience that teleologically oriented and dialectically constituted. Schemata may be viewed as microagents with semi-autonomous powers of telic expression that operate as self-states as they create spacings within the unconscious abyss. Schemata may take various forms, from the archaic to the refined, and instantiate themselves as somatic, sensuous, affective, perceptual, and conceptual, hence symbolic, orders within the psyche, each having their own intrinsic pressures, valences, intensities, intentional and defensive strategies, and unconscious qualia. The microdynamics of schematic expression can be highly individualistic in their bid for freedom, creativity, complexity, and agenic intent, and are tantamount to the instinctual and defensive processes we are accustomed to attribute to unconscious mentation in general. The difference here is that schemata are inherently both free and determined. That is, they are self-constituted and determinate within the natural parameters in which they find themselves and operate. This means that schematic expression is highly contextual and contingent. Yet schemata exist in a multiplicity of process systems that commune, that interact, and participate in a community of events that mutually influence the unique constitution of each schematic structure within the sea of the mind. This overdetermination of psychic processes ensures that unconscious agency ultimately underlies the constitution of all mental functioning. The multitudinous complex microsystems or communities of schemata evolve from an interceptive source we may properly attribute to an unconscious ego or processor as the locus and executor of subjective agency. While schemata persist and sustain their existence within the abyss of psychic reality, The unconscious ego is the synthetic unifying agency of mind. Furthermore, it's the unconscious ego that assigns agency to schemata, which allows for their autonomous actions. In this way, agency allows for both unconscious freedom and unconscious determinism. For schemata or autonomous self-organizations that teleologically define and execute their own course of actions. Here, emanations from the abyss conform to a sort of free determinism, where psychic life arises from and is animated by its own generative forms of self-organization and self-expression, at once given, forged, and constructed. In this way, freedom and determinism are modes of self-causation. In conclusion, the unequivocal centrality of agency in the constitution of mind becomes a pivotal and indispensable concept for understanding psychic complexity and justifying the existence of determinate freedom. Unconscious agency is ultimately responsible for all aspects of psychic functioning, from the most elemental and primitive to the most sophisticated, because following the principle of sufficient reason, psychic reality must stand in relation to its original form. From unformulated and inarticulate unconscious experience to reflective self-conscious reason inherent in the formation of self-identity, all psychic reality derives from its original ontological foundations.